does anybody care? This planet's empty, I see no signs of life. Please don't tell me that the human race did not survive. There are no people in the future. There are no people. There are no people in the future. No people at all. There are no people in the future. Where did all my people go? There are no people in the future. Let me try my people call. Where are all my people? Where are all my people? I guess I'll fly away now.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. Yes, it is Friday, May 24th, 2024. Welcome to Raging Chicken's Friday Politics Roundup. This is Kevin Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken. Each week we break down the good, the bad, and the ugly in state and national politics. You can support this show, become a patron for as little as $5 a month. Head on over to patreon.com/rcpress for all the details. You can also help out the show by heading over to our YouTube channel if you're not there already. Smash that subscribe button, like the stream for this show, and hit that notification bell so you know every time that we go live. And if you're one of our awesome podcast listeners, make sure to leave us a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen on. And leave a comment to let other folks know why you like the show. Little things like this help other people find the show. Well, in today's shows, more students were arrested for taking part in pro-Palestinian solidarity encampments or ceasefire encampments. Now more than 2,000 students have been arrested, more than at any time since the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations of the 1960s. And another new poll finds that 20% of voters in 5 key battleground states are less likely to vote for Biden in November because of his handling of the Israeli assault on Gaza. Great news. Tough loss for the UAW at the Mercedes-Benz plant in Alabama. To put it in the words of one Mercedes-Benz worker, quote, "This is probably the most strategic and organized union-busting campaign in decades," unquote. Biggest study on greedflation, that's right, greedflation, finds what most of us have suspected all along. Yep, big corporations, led especially by the big fossil fuel corporations, they squeezed us for record profits while blaming it on inflation or the economy or COVID, when it was just their freaking greed. Meanwhile, some scientists are looking to fracking wastewater as a source of lithium for electric car batteries. Now, I saw this story, I'll tell you right off the bat, on Live Science, and immediately in my brain goes to like, there's some freaking sick PR executive from fossil fuel companies that's looking for a way to turn fracking wastewater into a good thing so that they can keep on fracking. I have no basis for that kind of assumption, but that's immediately where I went. Just sounds completely suspect to me, but we'll see. And PA is the cyber school capital of the country. Yes, and our kids are worse off for it. And in the period from 2018 to 2022, the cyber charter industry gained an additional $485.5 million in taxpayer money to line the pockets of executives. And to take that money away from public schools. That's right. And national liberal groups are biting themselves in the butt by fawning over Representative Brian Fitzpatrick. Surprise, surprise, here we go again. Lessons not learned from every freaking election beforehand. But here we go. Hey, listen, everybody, for more PA-based progressive talk, tune into the Rick Smith Show's live stream at 9 p.m. Eastern on his YouTube channel, Twitter, Facebook, or subscribe to his podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Check out thericksmithshow.com for the latest across all his platforms. That's Rick's show right now is more critical than ever, I'll have to say, because what is happening with the labor movement in this country is both exciting and is filled with possibilities and also filled with lots of potential pitfalls. And staying kind of connected to what's happening in the labor movement nationwide from the kind of ground up grassroots worker perspective, you got to tune into the Rick Smith Show. And you got to check out also the Sisters of the Night Caucus podcast. Becomes absolutely even that much more critical as we move into the election season. The amazing PA women stirring the political cauldron behind this podcast rock the house, and they know where the bodies are buried. Make sure to follow them on Twitter at The Night Caucus. That's at The Night Caucus on Twitter, and subscribe to their podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcast. And The Signals, the new podcast from the Bucks County Beacon, not so new anymore, I guess. This is season 2. The Signal is hosted by the Beacon's editor-in-chief, Cyril Michaleko, and produced by yours truly. Twice a month, The Signal will shine a light on the right-wing extremist currents streaming through Bucks County and beyond. Cyril invites guests who can provide insight, analysis, and organizing solutions so that we can steer the community toward calmer, saner, progressive routes. Check them out at thebuckscountybeacon.podbean.com. Oh, boy. Hey, where's my other thing? Attention all you gamers out there. The Game Inn, that's with 2 N's. The Game Inn is a Quakertown-based black family-owned gaming store. They're friends of the show. They got everything from Retro N64s, latest consoles, video games for all platforms, collectibles, action figures, Funko Pops, walls of Funko Pops. You know it. You know they got them. You know they got them. That's right. And look, as we approach the end of the school year, good grades on report cards get your kids discounts. That's right. Look, if you've got a question about a game, look for something hard to get. They've got you covered. Check them out on their Facebook page and follow them on Twitter at TheGameIn. That's with 2 N's. Shoot them a message or drop them an email at thegameinpa@gmail.com. And if you find yourself in the Kutztown area, you've got to check out the Heart and Hearth Deli and Smokehouse, located at 466 West Main Street. That's kitty corner from the Kutztown University campus. Heart and Hearth is an American bistro featuring barbecue and French-inspired fare. Mwah. All with locally sourced and organic ingredients. Got to check them out. A special shout out goes to Jonathan Mann, who wrote our intro song, There Are No People in the Future. Check out all his great stuff and follow him on his YouTube page and Twitter at Song of Dayman. That's with 2 N's, at Song of Dayman on Twitter or X. And look, if we want a progressive future, need progressive media. Support Pull No Punches, homegrown progressive media today. Become a patron of Raging Chicken for as little as $5 a month. Just go to patreon.com/rcpress. We're here for the fight, and we need you. Become a patron for the price of a good beer once a month. Help keep the media in the movement and the movement in the media. Become a patron for as little as $5 a month by going to patreon.com/rcpress today. Well, welcome everybody. Here we are. It is, yes, indeed, it is another week, and it is filled with all sorts of fun and joy and good. It is Memorial Day weekend, and so I know some of you will have an extended weekend. Some of you will be going to Memorial Day parades, remembering maybe lost loved ones, lost their lives, the battles of the past or not so recent past. And so we will kind of, remember them. I hope it looks like it's also going to be the official launch of summer for real. We are finally in this, at least in this neck of the woods. Oh my God, my tongue is tied this morning. More coffee. Yeah, that's always my solution. With temperatures kind of in the upper 80s, finally getting that humidity kicking in. And what I didn't say at the top is that, the National Weather Service is saying that has predicted a record number of hurricanes this year. We shall see what that happens. I think the number was 17. And they're saying that's going to be, or I should name storms, I guess is what they're predicting. Maybe half of them are going to be full-fledged potential dangerous hurricanes. So there's that. So we know the summer is upon us. I just started reading this book. Again, not stuff I said in the headlines, but I started reading this book called The Heat Will Kill You First. I know. It's a book by Jeff Goodell, and the full title of it, The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. And he is a New York Times journalist, and he is kind of charting both the stuff around the heat. And this is a recent book, 2023, I think it was published, and it's quite good. And it's also a little bit, concerning as we're getting ready to kind of head into the summer. But it's It's a sobering book, and I wish I had. You know what? I think I tagged this. Let me just bring this up. I want to recommend this right at the top of the show because we are going into summer, and climate stuff is going to be increasingly important as we move forward. Where is this? Here it is. There was a great interview in by David Marchese, I'm sorry, in the New York Times Magazine. And the interview is with, let me get her name right, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She's a marine biologist and one of these experts that studies the impact of climate on the oceans. She is like I said, she's a marine biologist and founder of the Urban Ocean Lab. It's a think tank focusing on climate and coastal cities. She's also worked with the EPA and advised lawmakers, a whole bunch of stuff like this. But there's an interview, New York Times Magazine. It's called, it says the interview. It say this scientist has an antidote to our climate delusions. It's a really good interview. It kind of fell for me into this sweet spot of where my brain has been at quite a bit lately, and it's on the one hand is feeling not exactly optimistic about the futures. I mean, if you follow at all the climate news and follow the IPCC reports, things just don't look great. But what Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson does in this is talking about the importance of the spaces of hope and of love and of community moving forward. And why I like this interview so much is because she's not saying that, we just need to look on the bright side, right? She calls herself a kind of pessimist when it comes to this stuff, right? And she's basically saying, well, look, it's not all going to work out in the end. We don't need to just kind of don't worry about it. No, but recognizing that there's what's missing in the climate movement, right? And, we've talked about this before, but is that kind of positive vision moving forward about what's possible? And, that was this wonderful thing about the Green New Deal, right? About that space around the Green New Deal and the rise of the Sunrise Movement and stuff was this moment in time when we got a glimpse at a positive vision of what could be, right? Yes, there's dire, there's dire consequences to climate change that we are right on the cusp of. There's no doubt about it. But this is an opportunity to either reconnect us to others or further divide us, right? And she's really good. So I do check it out. Again, it was in this. It was in the May 18th interview in the New York Times with Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. Let me just read you the intro so you get a sense of it. This is beginning by David Marchese. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 2018 report on global warming drastically changed the way that many people thought or felt about the climate crisis. That report laid out with grim clarity both the importance and extreme difficulty of preventing global warming from reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Its warnings about what was likely to happen to our planet if we didn't turn things around were severe. The starkness of the IPCC's report led to a surge of pessimism, fear, and responses to these emotions, climate activism that hasn't really abated. But recently, there has been a growing counter-response to those darker feelings, including some from experts who have a clear view on what's coming, and that response is a cautious optimism, which is a term which I think she kind of rejects, but we'll get into that. Though she doesn't go as far as to call herself hopeful, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson is one of those experts trying to change the mood. She's a marine biologist and founder of the Urban Ocean Lab, a think tank focusing on climate and coastal cities. She's also worked with the Environmental Protection Agency and advised lawmakers on climate policy. Additionally, Johnson, who is 43, is leading a leading climate activist and communicator. She was an editor of the best-selling climate anthology, All We Can Save, and her next book, What If We Get It Right, which will be published this summer, is a collection of interviews with leaders from various fields about promising climate possibilities. The question posed by that book's title, What If We Get It Right on Climate, is one I think about often and skeptically. I'm not quite convinced that people are motivated more by positivity than fear, but I would like to be, and I was hoping Johnson could help. And so that's the premise of the interview, right? And it's worth checking out, to think about. And again, and Johnson is clear in the interview that, she's not saying that, hey, do we all need to be happy and look on the bright side and that's going to solve everything. She's like, no, just a recognition that people are not all motivated by the same thing, right? That fear and like the dire reports coming from the IPCC don't necessarily motivate some people. Sometimes that sends people into kind of pessimism and despair and cynicism and disengagement. Right? If they freeze, don't know what to do, they are overwhelmed by it. While there are those of us who, when you get that news, say, okay, this is kind of moves us to action or something, right? So it's a kind of good piece. Anyways, stuff that I didn't mention. The headlines are just there. So this past week, we're seeing more arrests of students for their encampments on college campuses in support of the people of Palestine. In the face of the assault from the Israeli government and the kind of near genocidal or ethnic cleansing moves that have been taking place as part of that assault. And as was just kind of reported in New York Magazine by Christopher Springham, that we're seeing that, more than 2,000 students have been arrested on college university campuses for these protests and these encampments. We just saw, for example, I think a new encampment just started up at UCLA after that brutal crackdown and kind of right-wing outside extremists coming in and attacking those encampments. Saw a new encampment get set up, and then police were called in once again to crush that. And so there's more arrests made. And what's interesting about this is, as it says in this article, I'm just going to read you a little bit of it here. So let's see. So today's encampment. So basically the question that this article kind of comes up. This is, again, like I said, this is why universities have started arresting student protesters. So why are they doing this right now? So it isn't because today's pro-Palestinian student protesters are particularly violent or disruptive. According to one study, about 553 U.S. campus demonstrations between May 18th and April 3rd, fewer than 20 resulted in serious interpersonal violence or property damage. That's about 3.6%, which isn't zero. But in the context of student protests on an issue that divides the university community, it's reasonable to see that number as success, right? What's also not broken out in that study is like how that violence is carried out, right? So it's not just violence from the protesters, right? And again, this is with all the caveats which we've been seeing about, look, there certainly has been instances on some of these campuses in some kind of like, I don't want to just say isolated incidents, but there have been instances, let's say, of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish propaganda being kind of spread and things like this. But this has been in the absolute minority. Some of this, that doesn't excuse it, right? That's not to try to wipe it away. But it's a recognition that the vast majority of these protests have been pretty clear-headed. And we saw this in some of the fantastic reporting that was done by the Columbia University journalism students, who actually, instead of just kind of taking talking points from lobbying groups from different sides, they actually went and spent time and actually talked to protesters, talked to people at the encampments at Columbia and other campuses too as well, and got a much more nuanced picture of what was going on and the carefulness and the thoughtfulness that was happening among the kind of protesters about wanting to make sure that this didn't become, say, either or type stuff. So, I mean, this has been the greatest number of student arrests since the Vietnam War. And there's a lot to be said about why this is happening right now. And this one thing I was reluctant even bringing up, this one article from this one by Christopher Sprigman. He's a law professor at NYU. It's kind of it's a mediocre kind of treatment of this, right? Of the issue about why the protest, right? Acknowledging that because on the one hand that because leftists have pushed their anti-free speech stuff. This is according to this professor. And what we hear about speech codes and all this other kinds of stuff, and he makes a case that some of that is contributed to us, but most of it has to do with the universities really not upholding the very basics, the basic aspects of free speech. So, for example, rather than all this stuff that he goes through, he says, I suspect, however, that universities would be cracking down even if no campus leftists had ever argued that some right-wingers' freedom of speech was less important than a minority student's safety. The central reason for the crackdown on pro-Palestinian student protest is both simpler and sadder. America's universities are, and long have been, only situationally committed to free speech. Specifically, universities are unable to adhere to their own avowed commitment to student free speech whenever an important part of their community disagrees with the message. It was relatively easy for universities to tolerate disruptive 1980s anti-apartheid protests because no one in the community was making the case for the racist South African government, although there were, predictably, a few apartheid sympathizers at Dartmouth. In contrast, virtually every university community is deeply divided over the Gaza war, as they were over the Vietnam War back in the 1960s. And in both of those instances, we saw universities engage in repression. The pressure on universities today to crack down may be even greater than in the past. What with billionaire alums meddling in university decision-making and egging on New York's mayor to send the NYPD into Columbia, Jewish students filing risible lawsuits alleging institutional anti-Semitism, and members of Congress agitating for the firing of university presidents and threatening inquisitions, powerful forces are lined up against the student protesters. In this environment, what university administrator would be brave or foolish enough to step forward to say, for example, that the Jewish state's legitimacy or whether Zionism is a force of racism are fair topics for discussion at their school? Right, and it kind of goes on a little bit for here. He says, I'm not kind of saying that students are just and all this stuff, but he's kind of recognizing, as we've heard, I've been impressed to have to see there's been more writers that have been talking about student protesters in a much more nuanced way and basically saying, look, what the youth movements have always been the kind of like a moral compass, right? About, having a moral clarity about injustice and things like this that have pushed the, the whole society forward. And that moral clarity also comes with, right, admittedly, kind of a less nuanced kind of understanding of kind of what the issues are. And look, I mean, I remember this viscerally, right? I mean, about my absolute clarity about certain things when, when I was in high school or college or so on like this, that now I don't. I actually would have to say, in some ways, a lot of what I thought and I believed when I was in college, I've become, sorry about that. I've become more committed to, but with a kind of perhaps better understanding of some of the stuff that's happening around there, and trying to think strategically about kind of how to address things or whatever it might be. Anyways, I digress. So to see universities as be like this kind of like force of repression, and and again, I can't help but read this. And one of the things he does not talk about in that article was, you have there are very few people who are out there making a strong case for education, deep education, critical education. if there's one thing that I have to say, about the 1980s and 1990s, when I was kind of, coming out of high school into college and into college during that period of time, as much as there weren't these kind of huge mass movements, although there were mass movements. People don't, forget. I mean, is that there, this whole kind of critical teaching and critical pedagogy and this kind of movement that was taking place. There were some strong defenses of education, K through 12 education and higher education, about the principles of what we should be doing with education, like a liberatory pedagogy, right? What does it actually mean to have, education be a force in, say, liberation and justice and good, right? And that was at a time when there were kind of increasing attempts to corporatize universities, increasing attempts to turn universities into credentialing factories or into job training sites, or to focus solely upon, careerism as opposed to knowledge and understanding and really the backbone of what most of us, at least within academics, got involved with education in the first place about, right? But now there's, that whole idea that, virtually all leadership, whether it's in the Democratic Party, Republican Party, whether it's the heads of universities, in many cases, in many kind of well-positioned faculty members, even for that matter, but really the leadership in higher education is more technocratic, bureaucratic, and careerist and corporate, frankly, than it's ever been. And so there's no strong arguments for critical education, right? And those few voices that would want to stand up and defend them are afraid. And it's like watching a mirror of what happens in the Democratic Party, right? Because the Democratic Party does not have an ideology, right? They claim, very, like almost laughingly to be like the party of the working class, right? Certainly there are people in the Democratic Party who continue to push that agenda, who continue to push to be, the party of the people. Right. But the leadership of the party is, like really more fascinated with Wall Street and all this other kind of stuff, and keeping their jobs and having this kind of like moderate position, which really just means more conservative position and kind of pro-corporate, pro-capitalist and all that stuff. Right. I mean, it is true that the Democratic Party is the only party that has a group of people that that are fighting for the rest of us. Right. That is, but the closer you get to the people, the closer you get in the House of Representatives and stuff like that, those Democrats tend to be a little bit more kind of especially the younger crew, coming out with the squad and all this, those be the ones who are carrying on that tradition in the hopes that could turn this party, or, kind of find a third party that's really going to kind of build and over the long haul to kind of get rid of this kind of corporatism. But anyways, so watching this kind of like mealy mouthed way of addressing social issues, economic issues, or whatever it might be, in the leadership of the Democratic Party is the same thing we see in higher education, right? No strong defenses of from leadership positions, no strong defenses of students, right? Unless you're talking about faculty unions in higher education, that's a little bit different. But even those faculty unions have been kind of like, mixed and matched, or have been it's been mixed in terms of what the responses are. So I don't know what my point is of this, but other than is like, here we have we're living through yet another period of time, which we're seeing the institutions that are supposed to be protecting democracy, the institutions that are supposed to be the part of the soul of what it means of creating a democratic culture, small d democratic culture, right? That is kind of like, the life sustenance really of any kind of potential democracy is becoming more and more looking like an arm of state repression or corporate sellouts. I mean, it's a tough. Now, again, I am not saying that everybody in higher education is this. That's not my point, right? Because most of the people that I know that I work with, right? Most of the people that I know, the faculty that I work with, the students that are involved in this stuff, the staff members are there, believe in higher education as a good, a public good, something that should be about deepening democracy and thinking about ideas and thinking critically about stuff. That's the vast majority of people that are on the working end of things. But on the leadership of everything, it's complete 180. And this stuff has consequences, right? And again, this is part of, I would say is one of the problems the Democratic Party's, particularly the leadership of the Democratic Party refusal to give up those leadership or to cultivate a next generation of leaders, is that we have both the president like Joe Biden and the leadership of the Democratic Party, although that's changing a tiny bit. They're still, they came into power in the 1980s and 90s. These are baby boomers working from a baby boomer kind of mentality. And what's happening in Israel and Gaza right now, and Joe Biden's handling of that, is really a function of an argument and a political discourse that was around Israel that was formed back when they were kind of cutting their oats, But the people have moved in a decidedly different direction in this, right? Especially younger folks. When you kind of because look, as much as the major networks don't want to kind of really report on what's actually happening in Gaza, right? Most people, young folks, and I'm even talking about under 30, maybe even under 35 or so, are not getting their news from ABC, NBC, or CNN or MSNBC, right? You're getting it from online, right? They have a much broader or deeper kind of reserve of sources to be looking at. Now, again, there's problems with disinformation. There's problems of all that kind of stuff there. But they're able to access things from, I don't know, like The Guardian in London, right? Like the internet is kind of like an amazing thing for that, right? You don't just have to follow the narrative as it comes out of the mouth of, say, the president of the United States, right? You can actually look at other critical sources. And when you see the reports that at least 35,000 people, civilians, some reports as much as half of them kids, are being killed by this Israeli assault on Gaza, and you've got a government and a leader of this government, Joe Biden, who seems unwilling to acknowledge that fact, to take a stand against ethnic cleansing, a stand against potential genocide of a people, and to continue to funnel to be the number one source of weapons in that assault. Well, you're going to disaffect. You cause a lot of people are going to be disaffected with your administration. And the Israeli government is only saying, October 7th. Yes, October 7th was horrific. It was a mass murder event. It was an absolute, yes, it was anti-Semitic. Yes, it was brutal. Yes, it was cruel. And yes, it should be like those people should be brought to justice. Everything. Yes, that was a slaughter. But that doesn't, again, in what world does that justify what's happening in Gaza now? It doesn't. As a matter of fact, what the Israeli government continues to do is to prevent the rest of the world to look at horror, equal horror, what happened on October 7th as Hamas militants went in and slaughtered Jewish Israelis, and the assault in Gaza, to look at those things and in horror, both of them said, this has got to end. This has got to stop. The extremist elements of the Israeli government who are now basically saying that, yep, we're going to turn Gaza into the next place for settlements. And they're going to use the justification because we have to make sure that Hamas will never come back. So the only way to do that is for Israel to kind of take over, and we need to get our beachfront property. Not good. And so there's a new poll that came out, and it shows you what some of the consequences of this inaction are, right? I mean, if your primary audience, you're thinking primarily about what's happening among kind of like, your senior citizen likely voters, right? Well, you're going to miss a whole bunch of your constituencies. So this is from In These Times, right? So a new poll of voters in 5 key battleground states has found that President Joe Biden's handling of the Israeli assault on Gaza is greatly impacting his chances for re-election, with some 20%, quote, less likely to show up for him at the ballot box in November. Now the poll, you can take this, I want to read this too as well because it's important. The poll, released Tuesday and conducted by YouGov, was commissioned by Americans for Justice in Palestine Action, or AJP Action, a political group, and voters were surveyed in Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, where Democrats narrowly won in 2020, as well as Minnesota, where Democrats and former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton edged out Trump in 2016. Right? So there's the caveat. This was commissioned by Americans for Justice and Palestine Action, but YouGov was the one who conducted the poll, and the results were concerning, right? So, quote, so what this opinion poll suggests is that Biden cannot continue to ignore the convictions and demands of a large segment of the Democratic electoral base if he wants to preserve his chances of winning, said Osama Abarashad, AGP Action's executive director. A large percentage of Democrats oppose his handling the Israeli war in Gaza. A larger percentage of them wanted to see a change in policy and immediate permanent ceasefire. Right? This is, again, this is another poll, right? I mean, what do you want to do with that is hold a question. You're talking about 20% of people are less likely to vote for him. Okay, does that mean they're not going to vote for him? No. Does that mean they're going to vote for Trump? No. Right? My concern is not that you're going to basically, these folks are going to turn around and vote for Trump, is that they're not going to vote. Right? As much as you want to talk about as much as we'd like to say about electoral politics, right? About why it's important. Like, again, I will say this 1,001 times, right? That I will be voting for Joe Biden. I will be voting for Joe Biden because I recognize the stakes, right? As I'm sure most of you who are listening to this also recognize the stakes of this election. He's like, this is not about liking Joe Biden, right? This is not about kind of like, saying that, oh yes, the Democratic Party is good. No, this is not about kind of like making, only voting for like a politician that aligns with my values. No, this is about a fundamental battle over the future of this country and what we need to actually hold the line against another march into authoritarianism. And again, for me, it's absolutely 100% clear. And if the disappearance and the eradication of Roe v. Wade is not enough, is not kind of like close enough into your memory to see that that's what we're talking about, at least half of American women, right, had their rights reversed because of Donald Trump and his appointment of the Supreme Court, because of the right-wing machine that is ready to kind of guide that battleship. Right? I mean, I plead with people all the time. We got to get out of this celebrity thinking, this celebrity culture way of thinking about politics. Like, we're thinking about the personalities of these people. We're thinking about whether they're moral. This is hard-nosed shit. This is about the fundamental conditions of our lives. For those of us who just went through school board wars of watching kind of like our school boards attempt to completely roll back our curriculum and silence like literally half a century of educational battles to kind of right size the ship. So, or that's not the wrong word. Basically, deepen our understanding of history, right? To be more welcoming to all peoples, all kids, right? To teach more critically and not just propaganda. I mean, that was like 50-year march. And to watch them wanting to, in one fell swoop, to reverse that, you don't think that can happen at a national level? You're crazy. It's already been happening. For those of us who work in an education industry know, we see the pressure all the time to teach less critically. And that, you know, again, I don't want to get off on a tangent here. So my point being is that there's no question here, right? You're never going to hear from me, oh, you know, maybe you should think about blah, 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 blah. Nope. I'm clear-eyed, right? And I'm not doing it because Biden is a Democrat. I'm not doing it because vote blue no matter who. No, I'm not doing it because I'm putting on a blue, you know, the brand, right? It's not about the brand. I could run through all the things that are deeply problematic about what the Biden administration has done, my frustrations with the leadership of the Democratic Party. But I'm also going to recognize, okay, Biden administration has done more than any other sitting president when it comes to climate action. Woefully insufficient, absolutely, but nonetheless, all the more important. And know full well, I mean, how glaring does it need to be when you've got Donald Trump basically going to oil executives and saying, hey, listen, you get me in there, you put $1 billion behind getting me back elected, I'm getting rid of all those regulations that the Biden administration just passed, right? We can kiss the climate action goodbye when it comes to federal government, right? This is a no-brainer to me, right? So that's not even the issue. The issue is about reality, right? And the fact is, especially people, look, the way that we teach kids about voting, right? And we invite them into the electoral process is that, unfortunately, our media teaches them, not just, I'm not talking about the classroom stuff necessarily, but our culture teaches them to think about this as, you know, someone who you can relate to, someone who shares your values and all that stuff, as opposed to having a critical thinking public that can, you know, is looking at these things critically. So we prime the pump with this idea that you have to really like the person that you vote for, right? You have to identify with them, right? And they have to share your values, right? Well, if you're basically teaching, our culture teaches people that's how they should relate to education because of our civic culture, our democratic culture is so weak and in fractured. If that's the mentality, well, then basically what's going to happen, right? When you have a president who claims to be the president for the people, who claims to support diversity, support the kind of the underdog, who wants to fighting ways to do better, and then out of the other side of his mouth is funding a kind of ethnic cleansing, genocidal action, whatever you want to call it, in Gaza, that is going to turn a lot of people off. And those people will throw their hands up. Yes, some of them will basically say, no. Yes, it is our job to continue to kind of promote. Yes, we need to get there. We got to stop the fallback. But it can't be about Biden is a good guy. Right? It's much more complex than that. We have to be talking about, like, look, if we're going to have a movement that it has any chance whatsoever of turning back, like, what's happening on the climate, of kind of potentially having a rule-based international order, which, again, Biden's action the other day, basically saying you're looking for ways to potentially sanction the International Criminal Court, an assault on the international rule of law. Are you kidding me? To a lot of people, myself included, that looks like you're speaking out of two sides of your face. And there are folks who are not hard-nosed politicos. You're basically, all they get to see is hypocrisy. And that's what turns people off. And so I don't know what we do about this. Right? I mean, obviously educating things like this. But again, I'm telling you right now, turning to young folks and trying to shame them for basically saying they might not want to vote for Biden, or they're frustrated by what's happening here, or they cannot believe, that he'd be supporting this, all that kind of stuff, by just trying to shaming them and telling them that just they don't understand, or they're gonna kind of vote for Trump, or making them feel more disaffected, is only going to drive them away from voting at all. I mean, I swear, I hope to God that the old gods and the new, that the Biden campaign is gonna lay out a vision, and the Democratic Party is going to kind of get it together. I hope, because this is a scary moment in our history. And the thing that kills me, and I've said this in terms of our schools before, is there so, I talked about this last week, like Anat Shankar-Osorio, she talks about painting the beautiful tomorrow, right? About one of the necessary aspects of what we need to do when we're kind of messaging about this stuff, and we're actually building a kind of program and stuff. We have to be able to paint the vision that we're striving for. Right, just like when I was talking about, that Dr. Johnson was, saying that, look, when it comes to climate stuff, we got to look at some of the kind of positive, we have to look at kind of community and not just the kind of scare tactics. I mean, I know this, I keep on going off on these sidetracks, but I was going through my phone, right, all the stuff that's going to spam, right, and almost all of it is from some sort of Democratic Party organization or candidate or something like this, and all of them are fear-based. Almost all of them. Big letters about like catastrophe and fear. And look, I'm someone who knows, like, I got a good sense of how serious all this stuff is, right? But I'm telling you right now, you come at me with this kind of like complete play for fear to try to get my anxiety levels up, it goes nowhere with me now. Nowhere. And I know that is part of the advice, right? When people do those studies about what motivates people to give money to X, Y, and Z. Well, at some point it needs to be action, not just kind of like afraid of the boogeyman. We've got to paint the beautiful tomorrow. What do we want? Not just what are we trying to stop, what are we trying to prevent, but what do we want? What is that beautiful tomorrow? Maybe I'll talk a little about this when we get to the end of the show today, because I do have some thoughts about some of the stuff on this show too as well. Anyways, we may have saw this too this week, and there was a tough loss. It was a hugely anticipated vote at the UAW vote at the Mercedes-Benz plant down in Alabama. Sarah Jaffe's got a great piece in These Times about kind of what happened in that vote. It was a close vote. I mean, it was a margin of about 400 votes separated those voting against the union from those voting for the union. This was a worker-led fight. You may have been following some of the coverage of this, and in the past when they have attempted to vote, organize a union, they've had, kind of union organizers from outside trying to do this, and some of the workers not really kind of jiving with the organizers. This one was organizer built from, like, internal worker organizer built from the ground up. They got tremendous support from President Shawn Fain for the UAW. And it seems like the fight is not going to be over, that they're going to come back. And now remember, there was the Volkswagen workers in Tennessee. They won their union, and I think that was after the third vote at that plant. So I mean, this is part of the history of unionization. It's like it's not a one and done. is that you kind of keep on coming back and keep on building. And so there's still a lot of move there. UAW has also announced that they're going to put a ton of money into organizing in the South. So we shall see. But we shall see. Nonetheless, it was a disappointing loss. But we'll be kind of keep an eye on that, because it looks like there's going to be some kind of really. It didn't feel like, at least the stuff that I read in Jaffe's report and things like that. Yeah, there were disappointment, but there seemed to be also this sense of commitment by the workers to keep on the fight. And unlike what happened in Tennessee, right? And I would argue this is probably the biggest difference. Is in Tennessee, Volkswagen basically said they were going to be neutral, right? That they were going to stay out. They weren't going to wage an anti-union campaign. Now, that's not to say that they didn't, attempt to dissuade workers from the union and carry on some soft union busting, but they didn't go and kind of go full guns blazing to try to prevent the union, right? That is not the case in Alabama at the Mercedes-Benz plant. Mercedes-Benz went strong anti-union. They brought in full guns, right? And so in a full-fledged, like, well-funded anti-union campaign, to see that the workers came that close to winning is pretty impressive, especially in the Deep South. So my guess is that we haven't seen the last of that, the workers at that plant in terms of the organization. There's a bunch of other stuff that's kind of going on with that too as well, about some unfair labor practice suits and all that kind of stuff, but that'll keep on going. Was it Fortune magazine just published this. I got to bring it up on my phone because they got me behind a freaking paywall here. Let me see if it'll come up on my phone or if I'm locked out of it there now too as well. It was actually a really interesting piece. Sorry for this delay, but I had it up earlier and then I clicked off of it. And then of course, what that means is that now I can't access it. Let's see. Nope, they're not letting me into it. But anyways, I read this morning and now I'm locked out of it. But so there was a big study of what they call greedflation, right? That was done by kind of researchers, and they were basically looking at, basically we were able to confirm what a lot of us already know, right? That what had happened in the aftermath of COVID, right, is that we saw record profits from major corporations, and we saw consumer prices go through the roof. Right, we saw this big spike of inflation, and initially, right, especially early on during COVID, a lot of that inflation had a lot to do with supply chain issues. Right, just had to do with like everything got shut down because of COVID. Right, that meant that we saw, international shipping lanes shut down. We saw products which we normally would have on the shelves not there. So, how you kind of get all those supply chains back up and working in the aftermath of COVID is going to raise prices. That's a classic inflation, right? So we saw that happening, and that was real, right? That's not like wrong. But then it seemed like, well, wait a minute. More and more people, and again, Bernie Sanders was on this right away. More and more people started to realize things like, well, it's funny. The like Exxon and Mobil and BP, they have just filed their reports and find out they're making record profits. And these different supermarket chains are making record profits, right? And then this company over here are making record profits, right? And meanwhile, you've got politicians and then you've got news media all focused on saying, this is inflation, as if it's a force of nature, right? And it was Bernie Sanders, again, one of the key voices in kind of saying this is greedflation. This is about corporate greed. This is not about, right, like anything about the market or supply chains anymore. It was at one point, but that's gone. And now you just have corporations, because they can, raking in the money and stealing it from us. And this study that was just kind of released found exactly that. And it was led, of course, by the fossil fuel companies. Right, found that the fossil fuel companies, Exxon, Mobil, BP, and there was one other one which I wish I could look at that article so I could show you, were at the top of record profits that had nothing to do with the fact that they didn't have supply to oil anymore. No, it had everything to do with that just because they could. Because they knew that people were worried about inflation and people were talking about inflation, so therefore would be willing to just think that the rise in gas prices and the reason why they've stayed so high must be because of inflation, must be because something that Joe Biden has done. Maybe they were mad at Joe Biden because Joe Biden passed some climate legislation. So they're just going to rake in the profits where they can. Maybe that's it, right? Well, this study came out and found out, yep, that's what's happening. That's what's happening. So, nice, right? Gotta love them. Gotta love corporate greed. There's this was a crazy little story. I came across this one, it was in Live Science, right? So, this is, I didn't look at this before. This is written by this guy, Ben Turner. He is, for Live Science, he's a UK-based staff writer for Live Science. And he covers it, but I just want you to hear some of this for a second. This is fascinating. The title of this article is called "Scientists Just Discovered an Enormous Lithium Reservoir Under Pennsylvania." Right, and it says this new source of lithium could meet up to 40% of U.S. demand. Right, so this is important because lithium is absolutely critical in everything from all the batteries we have in our cell phones, and if we're for electric cars, any kind of electric storage batteries and things like this, lithium is one of these key components, right? As many of you already know, and most of those mines for lithium mines are in China, I think India, and like Brazil, I think, right, are like some of the main mines, and that has been a concern, right, of folks in the U.S. to say, well, you need access to this kind of stuff and access to these, to those mines. So if there's any kind of international problem, then they could cut off that supply, and therefore we're screwed, right? So you get this article that comes up to 40%, maybe up to 40% of U.S. demand could come from what? Where is this lithium in Pennsylvania? Well, it's in fracking wastewater. Okay, so I'm just going to say a little bit about this afterwards, but I just want to read this to you for a second. It says, scientists have discovered a vast reservoir of untapped lithium hiding in wastewater from Pennsylvania gas fracking site. The wastewater, produced by the hydraulic fracturing of rocks inside the Marcellus Shale gas wells, contains enough lithium to supply up to 40% of U.S. demand, according to a new study published April 16th in the journal Scientific Reports. Right? Okay. Scientific Reports. That is called Estimates of Lithium Mass Yields from Produced Water Sourced from the Devonian Age Marcellus Shale. That's the title of the actual article that was published. Okay. Sounds good, right? Okay. So, quote, we just didn't know how much was in there, unquote, Justin Mackey, a researcher at the National Energy Technology Laboratory, said in a statement. Currently, 90% of the world's $8 billion lithium supplies are produced in Australia, Chile, and China. Oh, I messed that up. Australia, Chile, and China. I messed it up. The rare element is essential to the production of electric vehicle batteries, smartphones, laptops, smartwatches, electronic cigarettes, blah, blah, blah. And demand is currently booming, with prices surging roughly 500% year on year. Right now, the U.S. has only one operational lithium mine in Nevada, meaning huge quantities of the element must be imported to meet demand. However, given the importance of lithium and current plans for green energy transition, U.S. Department of Energy officials have set a target for all lithium based in the U.S. to be produced domestically by 2030. Currently, more mines are scheduled to open in states as Nevada, California, and North Carolina. Yet lithium mining remains controversial as it can release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as well, right? So they're saying a new way of finding this is basically in this wastewater from the fracking. Right, so they frack all this stuff. They have all this wastewater. Some of it's in pits. Some of it they pump back into the ground, and that contains all this lithium, which they are finding ways they think they can remove it from the water. So, what's threw up the flag for me is this: like, okay, let's just say for a second that That's true. So you're saying that lithium, you get the lithium for the wastewater, from their wastewater, right? Does that mean from just the existing wastewater or no? Because, I don't know about you, if we're talking about a green transition, right? We're talking to electrification, right? And need lithium for batteries for storage of energy. That also means getting off fossil fuels. But you have a source of lithium here that is generated by the wastewater from fossil fuel production, particularly hydraulic fracturing or fracking in the Marcellus Shale. So there seems to be this move where you could say, okay, I'm reminded of kind of Naomi Klein's book, right? This Changes Everything, when she gives this opening scene about a plane that gets stuck in the tarmac because of excessive heat, right? It actually sinks into the tarmac and it can't move. So they have to bring a truck out to kind of move it, and the truck isn't big enough. So they bring a bigger truck, and they have to move all these trucks to get the plane out. So they're burning more fossil fuels to solve the problem that fossil fuels have caused. And this seems to be like another example of this. Now, if you're saying that there's existing wastewater that they're going to try to kind of utilize in order to get this stuff out, I have big questions about, okay, what does that process look like? But it seems to me this could be, I could see, like I said, this a sketchy or really sick PR executive from fossil fuel companies looking at this and say, hey, look, we're going to start greenwashing fracking by saying the wastewater is not wastewater, right? But it is a natural resource for lithium. Right, so therefore we are good. We're doing good by fracking, right? I don't know. So just keep your eye on this, right? I'm just really curious if this has just come out, how this is going to start making its way throughout Pennsylvania as we approach the election. So something to think about. A couple great pieces that I wanted to talk about here. New report. This is both from the Bucks County Beacon. Peter Green just had an article that was published a couple days ago, yesterday actually, about the cyber charter school system in Pennsylvania. The cyber charters have basically been one of the biggest rip-off of taxpayers that are out there. So I'll just read you a bit from Peter Green's piece. He's basically talking about a new report that came from Education Voters of Pennsylvania, and looked at cyber charter assets and so on. And so here's from the article, quote, in 2018, the four largest cybers in the state reported net assets and fund balance of $566,858, right? So just over $500,000. In 2022, right, 4 years later, they reported net assets and fund balance of $486 million. So from $500,000 to $486 million. That's an additional $485.5 million in taxpayer dollars squirreled away in just 4 years. And how did we get there? States started passing laws allowing charter schools in the early 1990s, and cyber charters followed soon after. Pennsylvania passed its own charter school law in 1997. The law was tweaked to include cyber charter schools in 2002, and this is key. And Pennsylvania quickly became one of the leading states in the cyber charter movement. Why is Pennsylvania the cyber charter capital in the United States? The likeliest answer is funding. While other states use a variety of formulas and oversight methods, Pennsylvania simply and generously funds cyber charters as if they were bricks and mortar charter schools. As pointed out in a 2022 report from the PA Charter Performance Center of Children First, of the 27 states that have cyber charters, none fund them as Pennsylvania does. 0, none do. And while other states may require cyber charters to win approval from local school boards elected by taxpayers in local districts, Pennsylvania cybers need only win approval in Harrisburg. Pennsylvania has more students enrolled in cyber charters than any other state, with that number swelling during the height of the pandemic. In 2021, cyber charters took an estimated of $980 million in revenue. The Pennsylvania Cyber Charter School Association estimates the current price tag is $1.4 billion, but that assumes $10,000 per student for 144,000 students, and many of those students will be bringing in even more taxpayer dollars to the cyber coffers, taxpayer dollars that have been diverted from public school systems. And a 2019 study suggests that poor districts get hit the hardest. Right? The article goes on. This is a must read, right? So, I mean, it's like, you know, ever since, you know, how many times have since I've lived in Pennsylvania, I can't believe that this is like, it's not just like this is everywhere. It's like I'm literally in the place that is the only place that this happens. This is just another example of this. Pennsylvania is the only state in the entire United States that actually funds cyber charters like this. It just pretends that they're just like brick and mortars, even though they don't have the overhead, even though they don't have all the expenses that you do here, even though some of them don't even have freaking teachers. They just use curricula. And these people just like siphon money out of the public schools in order to kind of like make these people tons of money. Pennsylvania is the only place that does this. It's just like when I lived in the Penridge School District. The first in the nation to hire Vermilion Education to institute Christian nationalist agenda into curriculum into the public schools, right in my freaking backyard. It's crazy. But do check that out. It's a great piece by Peter Green, just published in the Bucks County Beacon here. And I want to close, I guess, with another piece from the Bucks County Beacon. By Kirsten Zolfo, and it has to do with kind of endorsements and the way that kind of endorsements happen. And the title of her piece, excellent piece, I strongly encourage you to read it. It's called Analysis: How Some Liberal Advocacy Groups Fail Voters with Their Flawed Endorsements of Representative Brian Fitzpatrick. You've heard me rail about my frustration with organizations like environmental organizations, Penn Environment, some other ones who've endorsed Brian Fitzpatrick in the past, of the PSEA, the teachers union, in Pennsylvania Teachers Union, who have endorsed Brian Fitzpatrick, despite the fact of, you know, all of his record and a bunch of other stuff. And Kirsten Zolfel does a great job of breaking this down. So she gives an example here, and I'm going to read this one for you so you can get a sense of it. She talks about a cautionary tale about what happened when it comes to something like gun control, okay? And what happens when liberal groups at the national level kind of overlook what's happening kind of a local level. So the perfect example, and this is from her article, the perfect example and cautionary tale of the perils of this mentality comes out of the gun reform groups Everytown for Gun Safety and their grassroots arms, Moms Demand Action. These groups were founded by former Republican politician and very rich person Mike Bloomberg, a man who talks about bipartisanship almost as much as Fitzpatrick does. The leadership of that group clearly feels that it is key to their success to ensure that their list of endorsees feature members of both parties, even as fewer and fewer Republicans hold any views that are remotely in line with gun reform. They feel that if they were to only endorse Democrats, even though Democrats are the lawmakers who are most in line with their policy aims, then they will lose a huge swath of centrist GOP donors. Thus, they endorse Brian Fitzpatrick and keep endorsing him, even as the GOP goes further and further into the swamp of Second Amendment absolutism. This untenable situation came to a head in 2018 when the Everytown/Moms Demand organizations decided that they were willing to lose an entire branch of their organization to keep Brian Fitzpatrick on board as an endorsee, his position on the national concealed carry notwithstanding. I spoke with Jessica Getz, a former leader of the now defunct Bucks County chapter of Moms Demand Action, about the situation. Quote, "As active members of this community, we knew that Fitzpatrick's record did not align with the gun violence prevention legislation," said Getz. "We had already experienced an Everytown endorsement of Pat Toomey in the spirit of bipartisanship, which was ultimately detrimental to gun violence legislation initiatives in the U.S. Senate. We had an incredible candidate running against Brian Fitzpatrick that year, who was a vocal supporter of moms and attended many of our events. Brian Fitzpatrick, despite multiple invitations, attended none. Getz then detailed how the decision of the national organization impacted the local chapter. After hearing that every town was considering the endorsement of Fitzpatrick, the Bucks chapter did everything they could to dissuade the folks upstream. They wrote a letter to the national organization and asked them that at the very least they could just stay out of the race and endorse no candidate, but it was not to be. The folks at the top had made the decision. Sadly, Getz concluded, quote, when every town disregarded our concerns in favor of playing politics with their endorsement of Brian Fitzpatrick, it became clear that the time we had invested in building the institutional knowledge of our district, relationship building with local leaders, police, and community organizations, and the dedication of our leadership and members, all of whom were volunteers, was inconsequential. After that, we could not, in good faith, continue to dedicate our time to an organization that had so little regard to its members, and we had no choice but to make the incredibly difficult decision to dissolve the Bucks County chapter. The Bucks County branch of Moms Demand Action closed up shop after the 2018 Fitzpatrick endorsement, and the organization's national leaders promptly went about imposing Twitter blocks on several PA1 our district activists, who dared to politely call them out on their decision to endorse a lawmaker who voted to rescind bills that prevented mentally ill people from getting firearms, on top of his previously mentioned concealed carry reciprocity position. But Moms Demand Action dissent. But for Moms Demand Action, dissent will not be tolerated, even principled dissent. To this day, Moms Demand Action continues to endorse Brian Fitzpatrick, and they continue to have zero presence in Bucks County. Right? That is the cautionary tale. Kirsten goes on and kind of talks about what we're seeing with the PSEA, past endorsements. She talks about how Pennsylvania conservation voters have basically turned a little bit of different direction. The League of Conservation Voters basically said, they say, no, we're not gonna be endorsing in this one. Because we can't in good faith. We saw this also happen with the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, right? Who actually came out and endorsed Ashley Ehas, right? Because they are looking at now. Truth be told, PSEA has a much stronger presence in a lot of sections of Bucks County. So PSEA is one of the big players. So we're going to see what PSEA ends up doing. And there's another aspect that Kirsten Zoelfel doesn't touch upon in this piece, but I also want to kind of point to. And this is something, again, this is, like an insider view that I had, friends who had worked from several different kinds of organizations in Bucks County who had worked to, they were not just organizing against Brian Fitzpatrick, they were organizing for a bunch of other candidates, right? Primarily Democratic Party candidates, but ones that were going to support things like education, that were going to support abortion rights, they're going to support, radical things that matter to anybody listening to this show. And what happened? Well, PSEA came in with an endorsement of Brian Fitzpatrick, as did Penn Environment, and that this was like 2 cycles ago, I think, maybe 3 cycles. And when PSEA and a couple of these other kind of bigger groups, in particular environmental groups, came out and endorsed Brian Fitzpatrick, all the door knocking, this actually during Hillary Clinton's election, election loss, I should say. During that election, this has actually happened now that I'm recalling it. And so all the people, all the organizations who had been organizing and building stuff on grassroots organization, right, who had been working to elect Democrats across the board, a lot of that ground game disappeared. Is those different organizations pulled out of Bucks County. Why is that? Well, on the one hand, there are endorsements that happen, right? And so if people are looking at, hey, which organization endorses this organization, which organization endorses that organization, right? And so for just an everyday kind of like person kind of looking at, news coverage and stuff, you see these endorsements go on. And they could argue, well, does this endorsement matter or not? But there's another layer of what endorsements mean. When an organization, whether it be a union, environmental organization, or so on, when they make an endorsement, they invest in supporting that particular kind of candidate, right? And sometimes what these organizations will do is they enter into coalition with other organizations as well. And why do they do that? Well, in part because, like, say, for example, if you're a PSEA, you're a big organization, you've got a good amount of money, and that you're raising members for, money from your members in order to, carry out political action, and you're going to support those candidates that you endorse, right? And your support meaning you're going to give money to kind of get the vote out, right? And sometimes you do it directly. It could be if you're PSEA, you do it directly. You kind of go as a PSEA door knocking. But in other cases, what happens is that you give money to other organizations who are doing that kind of door knocking on the ground, right? So you're supporting other organizations as well, simply because, look, PSEA does not have the staff to do all the door-to-door knocking, right? So they work with other organizations in coalition to support that stuff, right? And there's money to support that. So it's not just like volunteers going around door knocking, but you also have paid organizers who are out there kind of like getting people together, putting lists together, knocking on doors, keeping track of all that stuff. When PSEA and Penn Environment and some other organizations endorsed Fitzpatrick, what happened is all that money that was flowing to those organizations that were these grassroots organizations to help get out the vote, those organizations stopped doing the work. Why? Because they were supporting other candidates. Because they were not going to door knock for Brian Fitzpatrick. Because they recognize that Brian Fitzpatrick works directly against the interest that they were trying to support. And they also knew that if they bucked the system, right? In other words, if they kept on going out and advocating for and door knocking for Brian Fitzpatrick's opponent, PSEA, whatever other big environmental organization would pull their funding. Right? So rather than having their funding pulled, they just kind of quietly devoted their resources elsewhere. And so an organizational infrastructure disappears. That is the real impact downstream of when organizations do that. Not only you have something like Moms Demand Action, not only, right? Because what would have happened if that Moms Demand Action, if they went out and they said, if the Bucks County said, there's no way you're going to endorse Brian Fitzpatrick, no way in hell we're going to campaign against them. Moms for Demand Action would have ended their charter, which would have publicly disowned them and shut them out, right? That's what would have happened, right? Every town would have done that, right? Instead, they disbanded on their own. So this is why these endorsements matter. And so when I get on things like, get really frustrated with PSEA for backing Brian Fitzpatrick because they're trying to kind of keep things bipartisan. Where was he in the assault on our public schools? Where was he? He was on the other side of that fight. And so PSEA, I'm just using PSEA as an example now, comes in and endorses Brian Fitzpatrick, right? That's a slap in the face to every parent, every community member, every teacher who built amazing organizations to take back our schools and secure them for the future of our kids. It's the setup. That's why that cautionary tale that Kirsten Zolfel says in that piece about what happened with Moms Demand Action in Bucks County, that's a critically important story. So we shall see. So do check it out. a piece in the Bucks County Beacon called "Some Liberal Advocacy Groups Fail Voters with Their Flawed Endorsements" of Brian Fitzpatrick. Do check that out. Well, everybody, that's going to pretty much do it for me today. It's a slow slide into summer. I'm thinking a lot about a lot of stuff, and kind of what I mentioned earlier on about maybe I would talk about at the end of the show is that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about building community, and, you know, I've been thinking, you know, some of this is just real personal stuff, right? I mean, some of this is just, you know, thinking about some of the long-term or lagging impacts of COVID, are things like just the kind of, I don't know, kind of the distance that I have from, so say, friends and broader community and things like this that are not like, you know, it's nobody else's fault but my own, right? But it's kind of like a legacy of that feelings from COVID about being kind of closed in and focused in these kind of smaller spaces, and investing in stuff online and things like this, and finding out, you know, kind of the importance of reconnecting, right, with people. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and then I've been thinking a lot about what are the ways that we can also reinforce not just the fear narrative, right, and the dire situation narrative, right, or the problem focus, but also to look at, you know, again, like examples of that beautiful tomorrow, right? I mean, looking for ways to talk about the possibilities. And, you know, so I think about stuff like on the one hand, if you think of what happened with say the Moms for Liberty people and the book bans and all this stuff, I mean, so much of that was a defensive fight, right? I mean, so much of that is kind of, we have to prevent these people, we have to stop them, right? Stop Moms for Liberty, stop them, prevent them. We have to win the election to take things back and all that stuff. But that kind of politics, right? And again, absolutely 100% necessary, right? But that kind of move, it doesn't leave a lot of space for that beautiful tomorrow, right? And so I think about, you know, those questions about what schools could be, and I keep on coming back to Elizabeth Fiedler's push for solar in the schools, it's just one kind of example, right? It's like, what if, right? It's like that what if thing. What if we turned our schools, instead of our schools being these places of a concentration of energy usage, right, and fossil fuel production, but we turned our schools into places that generated, not only did they not burn fossil fuels, but they also utilize solar panels, right, to power the entire school and generate more electricity than they could use themselves, especially during the summer when schools are closed, but you still got those solar panels working, and that goes back into the community, right? I mean, it's a very simple thing. And then I was thinking about, and again, bear with me because I'm just thinking about these things that are really focused on climate at this point. But, you know, they did this project up at Penridge High School, right, where they did some renovations in the parking lot area and some other things, and they knew there was going to be, you know, runoff, right, water runoff. So what they did is they built this big catch basin, right? And one of the things that, you know, my daughter was one of the kids that helped out with this, is that they had students during school time, right, during these kind of free periods or clubs or whatever, or I can't remember what class it was from, they would went out and they planted, you know, put all sorts of plants into the water basin area that, you know, were water loving plants and stuff that would turn this into this kind of nice little kind of pondy area, right? You know, that would turn it into this little piece of wildlife, right? I mean, that is a beautiful moment. And then I start thinking about, well, we think about, like, say, Blooming Glen Farm, right, is a local CSA, and Walnut Bottom Farm is another. I don't know if they're a CSA, but they actually sell kind of locally produced farms and stuff like that. Right in the area, there's a bunch of these kind of stuff. What would it look like with a partnership with that kind of sustainable agriculture, right? And turning kind of, say, even if it's a small space, Doesn't have to be a huge, enormous space, but a portion of this extensive grounds from the high school or these different schools into like experimental laboratories, outdoor laboratories for sustainable agriculture, right? As that it got folded into some of the, say, biology curriculum or something like this, that we started thinking about, yeah, what if we got some hands-on experience working with these different things about how to do this stuff, right? Started teaching that kind of that next generation of those key skills, right? What if that became folded in our education? And then I started thinking about like all these reports about learning loss and all that kind of stuff. And you've heard me rail against this stuff in the past, but looking about why are we doing this? Why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we measuring our schools through these kind of standardized tests that are just about for profit for these education industry publishers? I mean, why? Why do we force our kids to go through that stuff when we recognize that it doesn't measure the skills that are going to be necessary for kind of a beautiful tomorrow, right? What would it look like to start pull away from that way of thinking about what we do in our education? Instead of looking toward the educational testing regime to define what our curriculum is, what if we started looking at our world and our communities? Restorative education, if you will. Right? And I'm not, I'm not an idealist about this stuff. I don't think that, oh yeah, this can just happen. And it's going to take work and time, but it is a certain kind of shift in focus, And so that's the kind of stuff I've been thinking about. So, some of you, I've gotten some emails from folks to say, hey, you're going to just start doing more interviews again and stuff like that. And I will. I'll be back on Out to Coop Live at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later. But I've been giving a lot of thought to the kind of folks that we're going to be bringing on and talking to. And yes, we'll still have some of these, obviously more critical perspectives and looking at right-wing influence and all this other kind of stuff. That's really kind of, my jam, if you will. But also looking for these spaces to kind of talk about kind of building community. Right. And thinking about how we do things to really rebuild our community. Thinking about it in my own life too, as well, about it, after seeing, place higher education, something that I absolutely loved and cherished for so long, to see it just being, an axe being taken to it. Just got me thinking a lot about, how do I put my energies? Where do I put my energies in ways that are going to be kind of sustaining, right? That are more hopeful rather than just kind of defend. That makes sense. So anyways, that's what we got going on. So, all right, everybody, I'm going to call it at that. And I wish you all a super Memorial Day weekend. I hope you enjoy some decent weather. Hopefully you're going to get the decent weather in your area. I know there's going to be some thunderstorms popping up. But at least in my neck of the woods, we're looking forward to a little summer weather this weekend. All right, everybody, have a good one, and we shall talk to you soon. This is Kevin Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken. We're getting out of here, everybody. See ya! There are no people in the future. Let me try my people call. Where are all my people? Where are all my people? I guess I'll fly away now.